Lightning split the sky above Maple Ridge, Colorado, turning the world outside Deputy Lila Harper's patrol car into a flickering nightmare. The radio hissed, rain hammered the windshield, and every so often, thunder rolled across the overgrown fields, rattling her nerves. Lila glanced at her partner for the night, Whiskey, her trusted brown mare, who stood in the horse trailer just behind, ears pricked, already restless. It was barely 5 a.m., but the 911 dispatcher's voice had carried urgency that made Lila's knuckles go white on the steering wheel. Deputy Harper, animal distress at the old Remington Ranch. Multiple reports, no answer at the landline. Nobody had lived there in years. Still, protocol demanded she check it out, even if her stomach was already twisting. She pulled up to the abandoned property, headlights sweeping over a patchwork of broken fences and weeds as tall as her waist. The barn's tin roof glinted silver under the rain, loose panels creaking in the wind. Lila threw on her slicker, opened the trailer, and led Whiskey into the storm. The horse hesitated, hooves skidding in the mud, snorting as if warning her, "Don't go in there." Lila ignored her own pulse, marching up to the barn, boots splashing through puddles. She dealt with raccoons, wild dogs, even the odd coyote. But this felt different. The air was thick with the smell of wet hay and something sharper beneath. Something metallic, like old blood or fear. Pushing the barn door open, Lila's flashlight cut a trembling path through the gloom. Rain hammered the roof, masking every sound but the thud of her heart. "Anybody here?" she called, voice steadier than she felt. Whiskey balked at the threshold, eyes wide, refusing to step inside. Lila clicked her tongue, coaxing her forward, but the mare's muscles bunched as she reared slightly, nostrils flaring. "Whiskey, easy," Lila murmured, shivering as a draft cut through her jacket. That's when she heard it, an urgent, panicked stamping coming from the far corner of the stable, hidden in shadows. Whiskey's agitation was contagious. The normally gentle mare shook her head, almost yanking the lead rope from Lila's hand, ears pinned flat. She refused to budge, letting out a guttural snort, stomping so hard the boards rattled beneath them. Lila's light flickered, catching a flash of deep hoof marks gouged into the dirt, wild scuffs along the wooden wall, and was that blood? A smear of something dark trailing along a beam. Her mouth went dry. She tried to convince herself it was just a wounded animal, maybe a stray trapped in here during the storm. But then Whiskey did something she'd never done before. She pressed forward, almost desperate, pawing furiously at a patch of dirt near the farthest stall, head swinging back to look at Lila, as if pleading, "Here now!" Lila's nerves twanged. The horse's panic was raw, elemental, a mirror of the dread crawling up Lila's own spine. "Okay, girl," she whispered, shining her flashlight at the spot. The beam caught the edges of splintered boards, mud packed over something hidden. Lila knelt, squinting, hand trembling as she reached down. The ground was churned up, still damp from rain leaking in through the roof. Whiskey whinnied, stamping even harder, nostrils inches from the floor, refusing to let Lila leave. It wasn't just animal instinct. It was something deeper, almost intelligent, as if the horse understood what was at stake. Lila hesitated. She could call for backup, report in, risk the laughter of the entire department if it turned out to be a raccoon's nest. But every part of her screamed that this was no ordinary animal call. Thunder boomed, shaking the entire barn. Lila stood, hand hovering over her radio. She pictured the ridicule. Small-town Colorado wasn't forgiving of mistakes, and she'd already endured enough snide remarks about being too careful. But then she looked at Whiskey, still pawing, sweat lathered along her neck, eyes wide with fear. Lila swallowed, her decision snapping into place. She pressed the radio to her mouth. "Dispatch, this is Deputy Harper at Remington Ranch. I need immediate backup. Something's wrong out here. Repeat. I need immediate assistance." Her voice barely wavered, but her fingers were numb. For a moment, she thought she heard something under the floor, something softer than the storm, a faint, desperate scratching, maybe a whimper. The noise barely registered, but it was enough to make her heart seize. She paced, flashlight shaking, trying to see under the boards. She saw footprints, small, overlapping, as if someone had been trapped here and fought to get out. She swept the light across the wall again. More hoof marks, more evidence of panic, of something trying to warn her. The sense of urgency grew until it was a physical thing. Her hands shook, her breathing grew ragged, and still, she couldn't look away. Suddenly, Whiskey let out a sharp cry, backing up, then lunging forward again, plus stumbled, catching herself against the stall. For a split second, her flashlight illuminated a pair of wide, terrified eyes, just visible through a crack in the floorboards. Lila's mind reeled. Was that? No, it couldn't be. The radio crackled with a response, static, and then, "Unit 12, back up en route. Hold position, Harper." Lila barely heard it. Her gaze locked with the eyes below, impossibly large and filled with fear. The realization hit her like a punch. Someone was down there, alive, and desperately trying to get her attention. Lila crouched, breath coming fast, as Whiskey nickered low and urgent. She pressed her hand to the boards. "Hang on, help's coming," she said, voice thick, promising herself she wouldn't leave, no matter what she found. The wind rattled the barn, but inside everything went eerily still. Lila stared at her reflection in the rain-dappled boards, Whiskey's trembling frame beside her. She'd always believed in following procedure, in not making waves, in keeping her head down. But tonight, she'd listened to something wilder, something ancient, buried in the bond between a woman and her horse. She squeezed the radio once more, feeling the weight of what she'd set in motion. For better or worse, the story had begun, and as thunder rolled across the fields, Lila knew there was no turning back. The sound of sirens pierced the storm, wailing through the deserted fields as backup units barreled down the muddy road toward the Remington Ranch. Lila's boots squelched in the muck as she jogged out to meet them, rain plastering her hair to her cheeks. She barely noticed the chill. Adrenaline surged with every breath. The barn loomed behind her, old timbers groaning in the wind, and inside, something or someone waited beneath the floor. She gripped Whiskey's lead tightly, whispering to keep the mare steady, but the horse's ears stayed pinned, tail lashing, as if she knew just how wrong everything was. Sheriff Doug Wilcox was first through the gate, his bulk wrapped in a yellow slicker, boots caked with mud. Deputy Randy, younger and eager, stumbled after him, flashlight bobbing wildly. "What's the emergency, Lila?" Doug demanded, voice rough. Lila nodded toward the barn, her mouth too dry for words. For a heartbeat, she almost wanted to take it back, to pretend she'd overreacted. But then she remembered the eyes under the boards, wide and pleading. They hurried inside, boots thumping over warped wood. The air was thick, close, and reeked of old straw, sweat, and something deeper, fear itself. Lila led the way, flashlight trembling as she pointed to the dirt floor, where Whiskey still pawed and snorted. "It's here," she managed, dropping to her knees. The other deputies hesitated, glancing at each other, but Doug, his jaw set, gestured for Randy to fetch a crowbar. The seconds dragged. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the barn in cold blue. Randy returned, hands shaking, crowbar clutched like a weapon. Together, he and Doug jammed the metal between two rotten planks, grunting as they pried them up. The wood splintered with a scream, and a wave of stench billowed out. Rot, sweat, and something sour that turned Lila's stomach. Beneath the boards was a shallow pit, lined crudely with old blankets and straw. Lila leaned in, heart hammering so loud she could barely hear the storm anymore. That's when she saw them. 4 children, huddled together in the gloom, eyes huge and faces smudged with dirt. They flinched away from the sudden light, blinking up at the adults as if expecting another threat, another blow. Lila's throat tightened. These weren't runaways or pranksters. These were victims. The oldest was a girl, maybe 12, hair hacked short with a kitchen knife, her arms flung protectively around the others. Her lips quivered, but she held herself upright. Blue eyes fierce despite the fear etched into her features. A smaller girl clung to her side, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, while a boy, barely more than a toddler, buried his face in the girl's torn shirt. At the back, a thin boy with jet black hair sat perfectly still, not crying, not making a sound. His eyes tracked every adult movement, sharp and haunted. Lila crouched lower, hands raised, forcing her voice calm. "It's okay. You're safe now. We're here to help you." The oldest girl hesitated, then pulled herself up a few inches, shielding the others. Are you here to save us?" Her voice was barely a whisper, brittle as old paper. Doug signaled for a medic. Randy's jaw hung open, shock in every line of his face. The medics swarmed in, gentle hands offering blankets and water. The girl refused to let go of the others, clinging with a ferocity that made Lila's eyes burn. The smallest boy shook so badly he nearly dropped the cup of water pressed into his hands. But it was the silent boy, the one at the back, who made Lila pause. He hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, his gaze flat and ancient in a way that made her shiver. As the children were lifted from the pit, Whiskey nosed in closer, soft and careful, lowering her great brown head until she was almost eye to eye with the youngest. The boy reached out, trembling, his fingers brushing the mare's velvety nose. His lips parted, no sound came, but a single word formed, shaky and new. "Horse." Lila swallowed hard, watching the dam inside him begin to break. The tension wasn't over. Sheriff Doug's face hardened as the realization set in. This was bigger than a missing persons case. As officers radioed for more help, he pulled Lila aside, keeping his voice low. "We keep this quiet, you hear me? No need to panic the town. Bad press will ruin us. Let's get the kids out and let the feds sort it out." Lila stared at him, a chill running through her that had nothing to do with the weather. "Doug, they need help now. The public deserves to know what happened. Those kids aren't from around here. If we bury this, who knows how many more are out there?" Her voice trembled, anger rising. Doug's eyes narrowed, the old power struggle playing out as lightning flickered between them. "You do what you want, Harper. Just remember who signs your paycheck." She turned away, rage simmering. She wouldn't let them be hidden. She helped the medics load the children into ambulances, staying by their side as long as she could. The oldest girl, whose name she learned was Haley, clutched her hand. "Please, don't let them separate us." Lila squeezed back, promising she'd do everything in her power. Outside, the storm began to ease, but the fear didn't lift. As the children were driven away, Whiskey followed, refusing to be left behind. In the ambulance, the youngest child, his eyes wide with wonder, whispered, "Horse again," a single, shaky connection to the world he'd nearly lost. The moment felt like a tiny bloom of hope in the midst of chaos. That night, Lila drove home in silence, haunted by the image of 4 terrified children pulled from darkness by a horse's relentless warning, and the knowledge that the real storm was only just beginning. The hospital was too bright, too cold, and the air stank faintly of antiseptic and old fear. Lila paced the hallway, the rubber soles of her boots silent against the linoleum, as doctors and nurses hurried past in a blur of white and blue. The storm had faded outside, but inside these walls another kind of storm raged, one made of whispered questions, anxious phone calls, and the fragile sobs of rescued children clinging to thin hospital blankets. Lila's eyes ached, gritty from exhaustion, but she couldn't let herself rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Whiskey's wild, terrified stamping. She heard the panicked scraping under those rotten barn boards. She remembered the sight of Haley's desperate face as she'd begged not to be separated from her makeshift siblings. They'd arrived in the emergency room just before dawn. The staff had moved fast, sweeping the children into exam rooms, their names and birth dates scrawled hastily onto paper bracelets. Lila had answered questions from caseworkers and detectives until her voice was hoarse, but the real answers remained elusive. Why had the children been there? Who had taken them? How long had they been trapped beneath that barn? And why, of all things, did it take a horse's stubborn warning to bring them to light? Whiskey, for her part, refused to leave the hospital parking lot. The mare had stood beside the sliding glass doors for hours, head high, waiting. Whenever Lila looked out the window, she saw families, strangers, journalists, curious townsfolk, gathered at the curb to gawk at the hero horse. A nurse even taped up a handwritten sign, "Therapy horse, do not pet." But none of them could know what Lila knew, that Whiskey's agitation hadn't faded. The horse whinnied and stamped if anyone came too close to the ambulance bay, her brown eyes searching every face, as if counting heads, making sure the children were safe. Inside, the hospital felt like a different world. The children huddled in a small waiting room, each swaddled in a scratchy gray blanket, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. Haley sat upright, her chin high, one arm wrapped tightly around the youngest girl, whose thumb never left her mouth. The toddler boy, called Noah, dozed fitfully on her lap. But Eli, the silent boy with the haunted eyes, sat apart from the others, knees tucked to his chest, staring through the glass as if he could see all the way back to the ranch, to the life he'd lost. A parade of social workers drifted in and out, their voices gentle but persistent. They brought toys, juice boxes, stuffed animals with the tags still on. None of it seemed to matter. Haley answered questions in clipped sentences, her gaze hardening whenever anyone tried to take her away from the others. The little girl, Emma, sobbed if separated from Haley for even a moment. Only Noah, youngest of all, accepted the warm milk and soft lullabies, drifting in and out of sleep as if nothing could touch him now. But Eli remained silent, his stare unbroken, refusing food, drink, or comfort. Lila stood by the window, arms folded, watching. She felt helpless, useless even. She'd faced angry drunks, raging wildfires, even a gunman once, but nothing had prepared her for this kind of hurt. She wanted to fix it, to reach through the glass and pull the children back into safety, but trauma clung to them like smoke. She pressed her palm against the cold window pane, watching as Whiskey turned in slow circles outside, always glancing up at the second-floor window, as if she knew exactly where Eli was. The news spread faster than the dawn. By mid-morning, local TV vans lined the curb, and reporters buzzed like flies outside the ER doors. Questions came hard and fast. Who were the children? How did they get there? Was there a kidnapping ring in sleepy Maple Ridge? Sheriff Doug Wilcox gave a terse statement. blaming outsiders and bad elements. Lila barely listened. She was too busy watching Haley struggle to be brave, too focused on Eli's empty eyes. Then came the twist. When the doctors tried to verify the children's identities, 3 matched missing persons reports from 3 different counties. But Eli didn't. No birth certificate, no fingerprints, no digital record at all. The social workers exchanged worried glances. They called state agencies, then federal. The FBI showed up in cheap suits, carrying laptops, and questions Lila couldn't answer. Still, Eli never spoke. He just watched the rain trickle down the window, mouth pressed in a thin line. Late that night, as the hospital halls emptied out, Haley tugged at Lila's sleeve. Her voice was small, careful. "Will Whiskey come back?" For the first time since the rescue, Lila saw something soft in the girl's eyes, a flicker of hope, a yearning for something safe and gentle. Lila crouched down, trying not to let her own exhaustion show. "I promise, she'll be here as long as you want her," Lila replied. Haley nodded, her grip tightening on Emma's hand. A nurse brought out Eli's chart, frowning. "He won't eat, won't talk, won't even let us touch him. He just wants to see the horse." Lila stepped out into the rain, calling for Whiskey. The mare came trotting, gentle despite the mud and the chaos, and stood quietly outside the window. The children pressed close, their hands on the glass, and even Eli, so lost and silent, leaned forward, his lips moving in a whisper only Lila could see. "Please." That night, as the storm drifted east and the cameras faded away, Lila sat by the window with the children, watching Whiskey stand guard in the rain. For the first time since she'd entered that ruined barn, Lila let herself hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could all find their way out of the darkness. Together. The days after the rescue unfolded slowly, the world moving in cautious circles around the children and the strange, sudden burst of attention that had landed on Maple Ridge. The hospital became a sort of fortress. Nurses on patrol, therapists in and out, caseworkers with thick folders full of questions nobody wanted to answer. Lila found herself making the hospital her second home, clutching lukewarm coffee in the break room while she watched Haley, Emma, Noah, and especially Eli try to make sense of life above ground. The town's shock lingered in the air, whispers following Lila everywhere she went. She overheard bits of conversation at the grocery store, saw the stares when she filled up at the gas station. It didn't matter. Her focus stayed locked on the kids, and on Whiskey, who had become something of a legend overnight. The brown mare now wore an official badge, therapy horse, and the hospital staff gave her a blanket and a stall in a borrowed ambulance bay. She was the only thing that made Eli's eyes light up. Each morning, Lila led Whiskey to the side entrance, and the mare would stand outside the window of the pediatric ward, blowing warm breath on the glass as the children pressed their faces close, drawing hearts and smiley faces in the condensation. Inside, recovery was a fragile, uneven thing. Eli was the most delicate of all, trembling through nightmares so fierce the nurses sometimes called for security. Lila took to sleeping in a chair outside his room, ready to step in if he woke screaming. She'd read enough psychology reports to know the signs. Trauma that ran deep, wounds that didn't show up on x-rays. Eli barely spoke. He wouldn't eat unless Haley coaxed him, wouldn't let anyone touch him, except for Whiskey. If the mare was outside, Eli would crawl from his bed and press his hand to the glass, drawing in slow circles, his breath fogging the window. One afternoon, as thunder muttered over the mountains and the world outside was washed in gray, Lila sat with Haley at a table cluttered with crayons and paper. Haley's hands were steady as she braided a lock of Whiskey's mane, the nurse holding the hospital phone so Eli could hear the clink of the beads over the line. Do you think we'll get to leave soon? Haley asked, her eyes never quite meeting Lila's. They keep saying we'll go to foster homes. Together, they say. But I don't believe them. Lila wished she could lie. Wished she could promise everything would be okay. But she'd seen too many broken systems. Too many lost kids shuffled from place to place. I'm trying, Haley, I swear. As long as I'm here, you're not alone. That night, Eli's nightmares grew worse. He thrashed in his bed, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, gasping for air, calling out words Lila didn't recognize. No one could reach him. Not doctors, not therapists, not even Haley. Whiskey, hearing the commotion, began to whinny from her makeshift stall. Lila, desperate, got an idea that felt half crazy. She called the hospital administrator, begged for permission, and then, against every regulation, led Whiskey into the pediatric ward under the cover of darkness. The sight was absurd. One tired deputy, one muddy therapy horse, and a line of nurses watching in disbelief. But as soon as Eli saw Whiskey in the hall, something changed. He reached out, trembling, and wrapped his arms around the horse's neck, burying his face in her mane. For the first time, Eli let himself cry. His sobs were raw, tearing, as if all the pain he'd swallowed was finally finding a way out. Haley and Emma crept closer, stroking Whiskey's shoulder. The hospital staff watched in stunned silence as Eli's shaking slowed, his grip softening. Later, Lila would remember that moment as the turning point. The first crack in the wall Eli had built around himself. The days passed in a kind of quiet miracle. Whiskey became a fixture in the ward, her steady presence soothing even the most anxious children. Emma learned to braid her tail. Noah giggled every time the mare licked his fingers. Haley spent long hours grooming Whiskey, telling her secrets no one else could hear. Eli, for his part, started to come back to life, slowly, cautiously. He still spoke little, but he watched everything, his dark eyes alert. One afternoon, he slipped a folded piece of paper into Lila's hand. On it was a drawing of Whiskey, 4 children, and a stick-figure woman with a badge. But the real shock came when the investigators pieced together what had happened. The man who'd taken them, their abductor, had died weeks earlier, alone in a nearby shack. Nobody had noticed. Nobody had come looking. If it hadn't been for Whiskey's instincts and the children's stubborn will to survive, they might have been lost forever. The news was both devastating and, in its way, a relief. The kids weren't in danger anymore, but the scars they carried would last a lifetime. The day after the truth came out, Lila sat on the hospital lawn with Eli, Whiskey grazing quietly nearby. Eli traced his finger over the horse's flank, lips pressed together in concentration. Then, soft as a breath, he whispered, "Mom." Lila froze, her heart stumbling in her chest. She blinked, sure she'd misheard. But Eli looked up at her, eyes shining with something fragile and real. "Mom," he repeated, and for the first time Lila let herself hope that maybe, just maybe, they could all be family. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains and the hospital lights flickered on, Lila knew they were all survivors. Wounded, yes, but alive. Healing was slow, but it had begun. And thanks to one determined horse, none of them would ever have to face the darkness alone again. Sunrise came late to Maple Ridge in those weeks, as if the world itself was slow to wake after all that darkness. Lila stood by her kitchen window, clutching her mug, the coffee already cold, watching fog lift from the barn where Whiskey dozed beneath a tangle of pink clouds. She could hear the distant rumble of a school bus, the crow of a rooster, but her thoughts were with the children, especially Eli, still wrapped in the cocoon of hospital safety, still not ready for the world outside. It was the social worker, Mrs. Kettering, who brought the news. She showed up at Lila's door with a folder under her arm, eyes tired and voice clipped. "There's no placement for Eli, not one that'll keep him with whiskey. He won't sleep unless she's nearby. He won't eat unless you're with him. I have to ask, would you consider fostering him, Deputy Harper? Just until something permanent can be arranged." Lila's throat tightened. She'd never pictured herself as a mother, let alone to a child so damaged, so wordless, so full of shadows. But how could she turn him away now? She looked past Mrs. Kettering at Whiskey, who seemed to sense the gravity in the air, her ears flicking toward the window. "I'll do it," Lila said, the words surprising her with their certainty. Bringing Eli home was nothing like she'd imagined. He clung to her leg as they stepped into the house, his small hand cold and damp, his gaze flitting between her and the door. He carried nothing but a battered backpack, which he refused to let anyone open. The house, so quiet, so clean, felt suddenly enormous and echoing. Lila moved slowly, showing him where the bathroom was, where the kitchen light switch could be reached, how the back door led straight to Whiskey's stall. She laid out a sleeping bag in her own room, just in case. But Eli shook his head. He wandered out to the barn, found a pile of straw next to Whiskey, and curled up there, asleep before the sun had fully set. That first night, Lila sat on the barn floor, a blanket around her shoulders, listening to Eli's soft breathing and Whiskey's contented snorts. The walls seemed to pulse with memories, her father's rough hands saddling horses, her own childhood spent learning to ride. And now, this strange, fragile new beginning. She wanted to reach out, to promise Eli that nothing would ever hurt him again. But all she could do was keep watch as the stars wheeled slowly overhead. Days became weeks. Eli said little, but he never strayed far from Whiskey. The two moved together in a quiet routine, breakfast in the barn, afternoons spent tracing the fence line, evenings with Lila sitting nearby, reading aloud while Eli doodled in a spiral notebook. Sometimes he drew horses, always horses, and sometimes he drew a girl with tangled hair and a badge on her chest. Lila realized with a pang that the figure was her. School was out of the question for now. The social worker agreed. Eli wasn't ready, not after so much upheaval, not until he trusted that this new life wouldn't vanish overnight. Lila let him take the lead. If he wanted to help feed Whiskey, she showed him how to scoop oats. If he wanted to hide in the hayloft, she pretended not to see, but made sure to leave a sandwich at the bottom of the ladder. Little by little, he began to test the world outside the barn. He touched the leaves on the aspen trees, watched ants on the windowsill, trailed his fingers through the dust on Lila's old guitar. Each small act felt monumental, a declaration that he was alive, that he intended to stay. Haley, Emma, and Noah were sent to a foster family in a nearby county, together, just as Lila had fought for. The separation was hard on all of them. Haley called once a week, her voice shaking, asking how Eli was doing. "Tell him we miss him. Tell him he's not alone." Lila did, every time, and though Eli never answered, he listened with eyes fixed on the floor, shoulders trembling with unspoken feeling. One evening, after a rainstorm had soaked the earth and the sky was streaked with gold, Eli came to Lila with his notebook. He held it out, silent, his fingers smeared with pencil and dirt. On the page was a drawing, himself, Haley, Whiskey, and Lila, all standing together beneath a vast blue sky. The figures were holding hands, a rough but unmistakable plea for belonging. Lila's breath caught. She knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "Is this what you want?" she asked softly. Eli nodded, his hair falling into his eyes. The next day, Lila signed the paperwork. "I'll foster him, however long it takes." The words felt heavy, permanent, and full of hope. She knew the road ahead would be hard. Tantrums, nightmares, bureaucracy, and her own constant fear that she was in over her head. But for the first time, her house felt less empty. At night, Eli curled up in the barn with whiskey, sometimes coming inside to sit by Lila's feet as she read, sometimes crawling under the table and falling asleep surrounded by the gentle hush of domestic sounds. There were setbacks. Eli flinched at loud noises. He panicked if Lila was out of sight for more than a minute. But there were breakthroughs, too. He began humming along when Lila played guitar. He let her braid his hair like Haley had done for Emma. He even tried pancakes one Sunday morning, grinning shyly at the sticky mess on his face. One quiet evening, as dusk gathered and whiskey grazed in the pasture, Lila watched Eli run his hands through the horse's mane, his laughter clear and bright against the hush of twilight. She realized suddenly that healing was happening right in front of her. Slow, uneven, but real. Together, they were building something new from the broken pieces. It wasn't easy and it wasn't always pretty, but it was theirs. And for the first time in a long time, hope felt less like a memory and more like a promise. By September, the leaves in Maple Ridge turned gold and rust, and the sharp scent of autumn filled the air. The barn was warmer now, lived in and full of small, hopeful sounds. Eli's quiet laughter, the rustle of hay, the steady, comforting shuffle of Whiskey's hooves. Eli had been with Lila for a month, but the world outside their safe little bubble was still a hard, unpredictable place. Each step was progress measured in inches, not miles. School, though, couldn't wait forever. The local district sent a counselor, a kind-eyed woman named Miss Felder, who came every week carrying a battered satchel full of picture books and soft toys. At first, Eli hid behind Whiskey, peeking around the mare's shoulder with wary eyes. But Miss Felder was patient. She let him watch as she read stories aloud, her voice gentle and low. Some afternoons, she brought her own horse, a gray gelding named Rocket, who stood in the paddock with Whiskey, both animals grazing peacefully. Watching the two horses together seemed to calm Eli, and gradually, he crept closer, eventually sitting beside Miss Felder as she read. It was Whiskey, though, who became Eli's lifeline to the world beyond the barn. Lila, recognizing this, started the process of having Whiskey certified as a therapy horse for school. The application was a headache. Paperwork, home visits, interviews. But Lila never wavered. She'd seen how Eli changed when Whiskey was near. His hands steadier, his shoulders less tense. His words, rare but precious, spilling out when the mare nuzzled his cheek or let him braid her mane. It was as if Whiskey carried a piece of Eli's safety with her, wherever she went. When Eli finally agreed to try school, he insisted Whiskey come too. The first day, Lila loaded the mare into the trailer, packed a lunchbox with extra carrots, and drove them both to the elementary school. The sight of a big brown horse waiting outside the fence was enough to draw every kid in the building to the windows. Eli didn't flinch. He even managed a tiny smile as he waved at Haley and Emma, who watched from the classroom across the hall. The teachers had readied a special corner for Eli, a quiet space near the window, with a view of the playground and Whiskey's waiting silhouette just beyond the fence. School was not easy. Eli startled at loud bells and kept to himself at recess, drawing horses in his notebook or watching the clouds scud across the sky. But Whiskey was there every afternoon, her head poking through the fence as if she was keeping watch. Sometimes Lila came too, parking her patrol car where Eli could see her. The routine became sacred. Eli would walk out, press his forehead to Whiskey's nose, and only then would he be ready to go home. Lila watched these moments with a complicated ache, pride, hope, and a gnawing worry that she couldn't quite name. She'd been so focused on protecting Eli, she hadn't realized how much she needed him, too. The quiet evenings, the laughter in the barn, the shared silences had filled something in her she'd never known was missing. And yet she could see the shadows that still clung to him, the old wounds that hadn't fully healed. One chilly afternoon, after school, Eli and Whiskey stood by the fence while Lila met with Miss Felder and a new social worker, Mr. Crane. Crane was sharp, with a stack of forms and a clipboard, his questions precise and unyielding. "Has Eli shown any signs of remembering his early childhood? Has he mentioned anyone from his life before the barn?" Lila answered as best she could, but Eli's past remained a closed book. He spoke little of before, only nightmares and fragments, never enough to form a whole picture. Then one evening, as the sky glowed with the last of the sun, Eli let Lila braid his hair for the first time. As she worked, she noticed a pale, thin scar running along his upper arm, jagged, old, nearly hidden beneath the skin. She traced it gently, asking, "Eli, where did this come from?" Eli froze, his breathing shallow, eyes wide. He said nothing, but when Lila pressed softly, he pulled away, running to Whiskey's side and burying his face in her mane. That night, Lila called Mr. Crane and Miss Felder. The scar was distinctive, sharp-edged, almost like a brand. Mr. Crane returned with missing persons files, his voice low as he matched Eli's scar to a description from a case in Nebraska. A boy lost 3 years ago, vanished from a foster home, never seen again. "It's not proof," Crane warned, "but it's a lead. We have to look into this." Lila sat with Eli in the barn that evening, the air heavy with secrets. She spoke quietly, explaining what they'd found, that someone out there might be looking for him, that they'd try to find answers, together. Eli listened, his eyes haunted, but he didn't run. He stroked Whiskey's neck, then finally, in a halting whisper, said, "I want to know." Lila wrapped him in a gentle hug, knowing the search would bring pain as well as hope, but also that Eli was strong enough now, with Whiskey and Lila beside him, to face whatever the truth might be. The next morning, with the leaves swirling gold around them, the three, woman, boy, and horse, set out on a new journey. This time they wouldn't be running from the past, but walking toward it, ready to claim whatever pieces of Eli's life could be found. Autumn deepened in Maple Ridge, and with it, an unsettled feeling crept into Lila's bones. She watched Eli at the kitchen table, pencil scratching softly across the page as he sketched Whiskey and Rocket grazing side by side. The house felt different now, brighter, more alive, but beneath every small victory lingered a sense of unease neither of them could shake. Each day, Lila sifted through old missing persons reports, phone calls, and emails from out-of-state investigators. The scar on Eli's arm matched one from Nebraska, but the trail grew cold after a few promising leads, leaving Eli's past only partly illuminated. But it was the strange little things that made Lila's skin prickle. The phone rang late at night. Hang-ups, nothing on the other end but static. A strange car idled near the ranch driveway, lights off, vanishing when Lila went outside with her flashlight. Sometimes Lila caught Whiskey standing dead still at the barn window, ears forward, nostrils quivering as if she too sensed something, or someone, watching from the shadows. Lila started locking the doors every night, checked the windows twice but never said a word to Eli. He had enough ghosts to chase. One Monday, the world seemed to shift. Lila was called into the sheriff's office where Doug Wilcox waited with a grim look and a sealed manila envelope on his desk. "There's been a break-in at Child Welfare," he said, pushing the envelope across the scarred wood. "Eli's records, gone. Somebody knew exactly what to take. Not a random junkie either." Lila's pulse spiked. Doug leaned in, his voice low. "Look, Harper, you need to be careful. This case, it's stirring up stuff you don't want to deal with." Lila clenched her fists under the desk, fighting the urge to snap back. "Those kids deserve answers, Doug. I'm not dropping this." The sheriff just sighed, rubbing his temples. "I know, but watch your back." She drove home, nerves frayed. That night, she found a note wedged into her mailbox. No envelope, just a single line scrawled in blocky black letters. "Drop this if you know what's good for you." She stood there in the moonlight, the cold wind biting her cheeks, the threat ringing in her head. Fear flared in her gut, raw and real, but when she looked through the window and saw Eli asleep in his nest of blankets, Whiskey standing sentinel outside the glass, the fear hardened into resolve. Eli noticed the change almost immediately. He'd grown more confident, slowly testing the world beyond their little sanctuary. But the tension in Lila's shoulders and the way she hovered near the door told him all he needed to know. One afternoon, he found her in the barn, arms wrapped around Whiskey's neck. He watched her for a long time before he spoke. "Are you scared?" The words were soft, fragile. Lila knelt down beside him, forcing a smile she didn't quite feel. "Yeah, I am. But I'm not giving up. Not on you." Eli looked down at his hands. "I want to know the truth, even if it's bad." Lila hugged him then, Whiskey's breath warm against both their cheeks, and whispered, "I'll fight for you, whatever it takes." Determined to uncover more, Lila spent hours poring over every scrap of information. One chilly afternoon, she climbed into the barn loft to search for any clue the previous owners might have left behind. Cobwebs clung to her hair as she moved old boxes and battered trunks. She nearly missed it. A photograph, yellowed with age, stuck between the rafters. It showed a woman with tired eyes holding a baby boy, his dark hair wild and familiar. On the back, in faded ink, was a single line, "Don't forget me." Lila's heart pounded as she studied the baby's face. The resemblance to Eli was undeniable. She showed it to Eli that night, and though he said nothing, his eyes lingered on the photo long after Lila set it down. With every step, new pieces of the puzzle fell into place, but so did new dangers. The break-in at Child Welfare wasn't the end. Twice, Lila spotted the same unmarked van parked down the road. She notified the sheriff, but by the time a patrol car arrived, it was gone. Whiskey grew jumpier, stamping and snorting at night, her vigilance unrelenting. Lila put up extra lights around the barn, left her service pistol on the kitchen table, and kept her phone charged at all times. Despite the tension, the small household clung to their fragile routine. Eli went to school with Whiskey at his side, and every day after class, he'd run to her at the fence, whispering secrets into her mane. Sometimes Haley and Emma would visit, bringing cookies and hand-me-down books, sitting in the grass while Eli read aloud in halting sentences. The little family grew closer, bound together not just by trauma, but by the stubborn hope that the truth could set them free. Late one evening, as Lila tucked Eli into bed, he held out the old photo, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you think she's still out there?" Lila knelt beside him, brushing hair from his brow. "I don't know, but if she is, we'll find her. You deserve to know where you come from." Eli nodded, his jaw set with a determination Lila had come to recognize as her own. As the moon rose over the barn and the wind rattled the windows, Lila sat at her desk, the warning note in one hand and the photograph in the other. She felt the weight of every decision, every promise. Someone didn't want them to find the truth, but she would not back down, not when Eli's entire future was at stake. Outside, Whiskey stood guard beneath the stars, her silhouette a quiet reassurance against the darkness, a living reminder that even when the past comes calling, no one has to face it alone. The cold arrived early in Maple Ridge that year, painting frost along the edges of every window pane and turning the pastures silver under the early morning light. Despite the chill, the old Remington barn was finally coming down, bulldozers idling at the edge of the property, their engines loud in the clear October air. People gathered along the roadside, some in heavy coats, others clutching mugs of coffee, everyone drawn by the story that had shaken the town to its core. At the center of it all stood Lila, Eli, and Whiskey, the horse's breath clouding in the cold, her body pressed close to Eli's side as if she understood how much he needed her. Word had spread fast after the break-in at Child Welfare and the missing files. Reporters returned, their voices bright with outrage and curiosity. But it was the town's own people who demanded answers this time. Lila watched them gather at Town Hall that evening, a crowd bigger than any she'd seen in years. Teachers, ranchers, parents, teenagers, even Sheriff Doug Wilcox in his pressed uniform, all packed together under the fluorescent lights, their faces drawn with worry and determination. Lila felt Whiskey's reassuring nudge against her shoulder as she led Eli inside, the boy's fingers twined tightly with hers. The meeting was tense from the start. Doug tried to speak first, his voice stiff with official worry, but the townspeople cut him off, demanding to know how 4 children could be trapped in their own backyard for so long, how records could disappear, how a child like Eli could fall through every crack in the system and vanish for years. Lila stood in the back, her heart pounding, feeling the collective energy in the room. Fear, anger, but also the glimmer of something better. It was time for the truth. When Lila stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted instantly. She looked out at faces she'd known since childhood, neighbors and strangers, teachers who'd taught her to read, parents whose own children now played at her barn. She took a breath, found Eli in the front row with Haley, Emma, and Whiskey, pressed up against the glass doors outside. "My name is Lila Harper," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Most of you know me. Some of you might not know the whole story yet. What happened to Eli, to Haley, Emma, and Noah? It's not just a tragedy. It's a failure of every system meant to protect our kids. It's a wake-up call." She told the story plainly, letting the facts speak for themselves. The barn, the rescue, the broken records, the threats and warnings, the photo found in the loft. She watched as the room filled with tears, gasps, and fierce nods of support. Eli was trafficked as a toddler. His records were lost. His mother presumed dead. But she's alive. She's been found in another state, recovering in a women's shelter, never giving up hope her son was out there. The room erupted, some people hugging, others wiping their eyes, the weight of what had happened settling heavily on everyone's shoulders. Eli sat quietly throughout, his hand in Haley's, Whiskey's face framed in the window. When the crowd pressed closer, asking questions, Eli surprised everyone by rising from his seat, his voice soft but sure. "I just want to know where I came from. I want other kids to be found too. Please, don't let what happened to us happen to anyone else." His words rippled across the room, silencing even the angriest voices. In that moment, Eli's courage sparked something bigger than any one story. It inspired a community to do more. The town voted, right then and there, to tear down the old barn. every board and memory of what had happened there, and to build something new in its place, a children's center named after whiskey. Plans were drawn up before the night was over. Volunteers offered money, labor, and supplies. Haley suggested therapy animals for traumatized kids. Emma wanted a library. Noah asked for a playground. Lila wrote down every request, her heart swelling with pride and disbelief. The project wasn't just about bricks and mortar. It was about making sure no child was ever lost or forgotten again. When the night ended, Lila walked out into the cold with Eli and whiskey at her side. Reporters asked for interviews, but Lila kept her focus on the little circle of people who mattered most: Eli, Haley, Emma, and the neighbors who had shown up to do the right thing. The old barn came down the next morning, the air sharp with sawdust and memory, and for the first time Lila felt like she could breathe again. A week later, the town gathered for the groundbreaking of the new center. The mayor handed Eli a small silver spade, and with whiskey at his side, he dug the first scoop of earth. Lila watched his hands, no longer shaking, no longer afraid, steady and determined as he worked. The crowd cheered, flashbulbs popped, and for a moment, the whole world felt full of light. After the ceremony, Eli's mother arrived, frail and hopeful, still recovering but finally ready to meet the boy she'd lost. The reunion was quiet and awkward at first. Two strangers with the same eyes, circling one another, searching for the right words. Lila stayed close, her hand on Eli's shoulder, whiskey pressed in between them like a living bridge. Slowly, the wall between them began to fall. There were tears, soft laughter, the hesitant promise of forgiveness. As the sun set behind Maple Ridge, Lila looked around and saw a town transformed, not by tragedy, but by the stubborn refusal to let it define them. Eli and his mother stood together, Haley and Emma laughing nearby, whiskey grazing peacefully at their feet. And for the first time, Lila truly believed that the worst storms could give way to something new, something good, if only enough people had the courage to stand together and fight for it. The day of the grand opening dawned bright and clear, the sky a rare, flawless blue above Maple Ridge. The old barn was long gone, replaced by the gleaming glass and warm wood of the new children's center, Whiskey's Place. The sign out front read in bold green letters. Balloons bobbed from the new railings, and the laughter of children carried on the wind. Lila stood by the entrance, watching the crowd gather. Families, city officials, doctors, teachers, and half the town's kids, all drawn together for this moment. But it wasn't just the building or the playground that mattered most. It was what the day stood for. It was what they'd all fought for. Inside, the air hummed with excitement and a kind of nervous reverence. The therapy room, soft rugs, bookshelves lined with stories, bright sunlight slanting across Whiskey's photograph on the wall, was already filled with children petting animals, coloring, and playing games. Outside, Eli waited in his best shirt, hand in hand with Lila, Haley, and Emma. Whiskey's lead rope looped loosely in his other hand. The horse was calm, content, tail flicking as the breeze carried voices and music from the makeshift stage. Lila felt the day catch in her chest, a tightness that was both joy and ache. It was hard not to look back, on the ruined barn, the long nights of fear and uncertainty, the endless bureaucracy, the wounds that sometimes felt too deep to heal. But today, the scars felt less like marks of pain and more like medals earned in a battle survived. She glanced at Eli, remembering the frightened, silent child she'd found beneath the boards, and marveled at the boy he'd become. There was a calmness in him now, a dignity. He wasn't the lost boy anymore. He was part of something, of a family, of a community that had chosen not to turn away. The speeches began with the mayor, predictable words about resilience and hope, about Maple Ridge rising to meet its darkest moment. Lila barely heard him. Her eyes found Eli, who waited quietly for his turn, hands trembling just a little. She squeezed his shoulder, whispered, "You can do this." Eli nodded, his face serious, his gaze never leaving Whiskey's gentle eyes. Then, as the applause faded, Lila guided him up to the microphone. He stood for a moment, surveying the crowd, the notes he'd written shaking slightly in his hands. Haley flashed him a thumbs up. Emma mouthed, "Go, Eli," and Lila smiled at him, steady, unwavering. Eli took a deep breath and began, his voice small but clear. "My name is Eli. I lived for a long time without a home. There were days I thought no one would ever find me. But someone did. A horse named Whiskey, a deputy who wouldn't give up, and friends who stuck by me even when it was hard." A hush fell over the crowd. Eli continued, pausing when his voice threatened to crack, but never backing away from his truth. "Sometimes people ask if I'm all better now. I'm not. Sometimes I still get scared or sad or mad at things I can't remember. But I learned that you don't have to be alone. You can ask for help even when it's hard. And when you can't talk, you can just listen. Whiskey doesn't talk, but she always listens." He glanced at Lila, then back at the crowd. "Thank you for not forgetting me, for building this place for other kids like me, for listening, even when it hurt. I hope we can all help somebody else, even if it's just a little bit. You never know when it will change someone's whole life." There was a moment of stillness, then thunderous applause. Lila blinked back tears, pride surging so fierce she could hardly breathe. She remembered the first time Eli had spoken in her kitchen, the long months when even a single word was a victory. Now here he was, hand in hand with his found family, sharing his story for all the world to hear. As the day unfolded, Lila wandered through the new center, watching as the town came alive with purpose. Volunteers signed up to read with children, ranchers donated hay and supplies for the therapy animals, and neighbors who'd never spoken before laughed together under the new gazebo. Haley and Emma led a group of kids in painting a mural, their laughter echoing against the fresh white walls. Noah, who'd been the smallest and shyest, raced across the playground, fearless at last. In a quiet moment, Lila stood outside with Whiskey, looking out over the playground as dusk settled. Eli joined her, slipping his hand into hers, both silent for a long while. Finally, Lila spoke, her voice gentle. "You did something brave today. You helped people see that healing doesn't happen alone. You showed them what love looks like. Real love. The kind that sticks around when things get hard." Eli leaned his head against her arm. "I couldn't have done it without you and Whiskey." Lila smiled, tears threatening again. "You could have, but I'm glad you let us help." As the sun dipped below the ridge, candles were lit across the lawn, flickering as night gathered. Lila listened to the voices around her, people sharing stories, offering comfort, building a new kind of community. She knew, deep in her bones, that the lesson of the past year would linger. Healing from trauma is not a solo journey. It takes a web of support, human and animal, and the quiet, stubborn courage to show up every day, even when it's hard. Sometimes the most wounded among us are the ones who bring out the best in others. Whiskey wasn't just a horse. She was a living bridge between silence and trust, a reminder that small acts of compassion could change the world. Before the evening ended, Eli asked if he could say one more thing. Lila brought him to the stage where he spoke, this time with the ease of a boy who knows he's safe. "We have to look out for each other," he said. his voice ringing in the night. We have to listen, and not just when someone's loud or angry, especially to the quiet ones. You never know what someone is going through, or how much you might matter to them. The crowd listened, candles in hand, and in that quiet, Lila felt a promise settle over the town, a vow to be vigilant, to be kind, to always pay attention to those who have no voice. And as the last light faded, Lila, Eli, and Whiskey stood together at the center of it all, knowing they'd helped spark something that would last far beyond the pain they'd survived. 1 year later, Maple Ridge had changed in ways big and small. The scars from what had happened at the Remington Ranch weren't forgotten, but they'd faded into something different. Part of the story, but not the ending. Every morning, laughter spilled from the windows of Whiskey's place. On the playground, children ran barefoot through grass that had once been trampled mud, and their voices carried all the way to the rebuilt fence line where Whiskey grazed, her brown coat glossy in the sunlight, now officially the mascot of the center and the whole town's symbol of hope. Inside the center, the walls were covered with art. Murals painted by Haley and Emma, photos of kids and horses, letters from families who'd found healing here. Volunteers filled the schedule, reading to children, organizing writing lessons, showing up just to listen. Therapy horses rotated through, but none drew a bigger crowd than Whiskey. She'd become a legend, her gentle presence calming anxious hands, coaxing laughter from children who still struggled with nightmares or sadness. Even the adults found comfort in her. Lila sometimes watched parents stand quietly at the fence, one hand resting on Whiskey's neck, as if drawing strength for the road ahead. Eli thrived in this new world. His laughter had grown easy, no longer rare or uncertain. He was taller, stronger, but most of all, he was confident. No longer the lost boy who flinched at every loud sound or unexpected touch. He helped with the horses, read to the smaller children, and sometimes, when a newcomer was too scared to speak, Eli would sit with them in silence, Whiskey beside him, both offering comfort the way they knew best. Lila watched him with a mother's pride and wonder, still in awe of how far he'd come. The formal adoption had happened months before in a quiet ceremony in the county courthouse. Lila remembered how Eli had squeezed her hand as the judge asked if he wanted to make this family forever. He'd nodded, eyes shining. Lila had answered yes without hesitation, her voice strong and certain. Now, when she looked at him across the breakfast table or found him asleep on the porch with Whiskey standing guard, she felt a gratitude so deep it sometimes brought her to tears. The town gathered again that summer for a sunset vigil, candles flickering along the paths and around the new statue of Whiskey, cast in bronze, mane windswept, her eyes as watchful as ever. People brought flowers, thank you notes, and in a new tradition, small bells tied with ribbons, each one representing a child helped, a family reunited, a life changed. Lila stood near the statue, Eli's hand in hers, as the mayor welcomed the crowd and shared stories of the year gone by, of kids who found their voices again, of parents who learned to hope, of a town that learned how to listen. As dusk settled, the crowd fell quiet. Lila stepped forward, her heart thundering, feeling the weight of the moment but also its possibility. She spoke plainly, not as a deputy or a founder, but as a neighbor, a parent, a survivor. Courage, she said, her voice carrying across the lawn, isn't always big or loud. Sometimes it's just showing up, day after day, loving through pain, believing that healing is possible. Sometimes it's listening when someone can't find the words. Sometimes it's trusting a horse's instincts, or a child's quiet hope. She looked at Eli, who smiled at her, then out at the hundreds of faces illuminated by candlelight. We built this place together, and together we keep making it better, not by forgetting the past, but by making sure it becomes part of a bigger story, one about second chances and the power of kindness to change a life. Even on the hardest days, none of us are alone. The crowd listened, the air shimmering with emotion. Lila finished, "Listen to those who cannot speak for themselves. Trust your instincts, and never underestimate the power of kindness. Sometimes it only takes one person or one horse to change the world." Eli stepped forward then, his voice confident, calling out, "Thank you for giving me a family and for believing that I could belong." Haley, Emma, and Noah joined him, and together they rang the bells on the statue, their laughter echoing into the evening. The sound carried hope through the crowd, a sound of survival and of beginnings that would outlast any old sorrow. As darkness fell, Lila felt someone slip their arm around her shoulders. It was Eli, grinning up at her, a hint of mischief in his eyes. "Ready to go home, Mom?" She smiled, wiping at her eyes, and nodded. Whiskey, as if she understood every word, came and rested her head across both their shoulders, warm and solid and endlessly patient. The three of them, family by choice and by love, stood together a moment longer, soaking in the glow of lanterns and laughter. They walked home side by side, the road silvered by moonlight, candles twinkling behind them. Lila looked ahead and felt the world open, every step lit by a hope that no longer felt fragile or out of reach. The wounds of the past would never disappear, but they had become something else. Reminders of what they had overcome. Proof of the strength found in choosing, again and again, to love and to trust. As the door closed behind them, Lila glanced back once more, watching Whiskey's silhouette in the yard, strong and steady, guardian of the new world they had built together. The town would sleep peacefully tonight, and when the sun rose, there would be more laughter, more healing, and more stories waiting to be written. Because Maple Ridge had learned, sometimes it takes just one act of courage to change everything, and sometimes it takes the heart of a child and the spirit of a horse to remind an entire town how to begin again.